All right, so we are recording. So we've got, my name is Maile and I'm an occupational therapist and owner at Empire Therapy. And today we're going to talk about spinal galant. So spinal galant onsets on the wiggle out of the birth canal. So you literally wiggle yourself out of the birth canal. And it's at spinal levels T1 and L5. So T1 is right up here and L5 is way down here. You can see the baby breastfeeding, and the suck is stimulated while side lying and breastfeeding. But it will integrate spinal galant to find the sides also in breastfeeding, which is a really nice position for babies to be in. The reflex itself develops in utero at the 10th week. So there are some contraindications to spinal galant. So one of the things that often we will see is that a wiggle seat will be given to a kiddo because they're super wiggly and they're like, if I give them a wiggle seat, then they have something to move on the entire day. But what spinal galant is trying to do is create stability lines. So it's trying to create the stability line here at the shoulder, and then it's trying to create the stability line here at the hip. And if you give a wiggle seat, there's nowhere for the hips or the shoulders to find that stability. So what you really want to put kids on is a really hard surface like a wooden chair, because then they're finding one point of stability, even if they are wiggly. When you are putting toddlers or infants into a chair when they can sit, you also want to have them on a solid surface to help them to develop trunk extension and spinal galant integration. So trunk extension, like you saw in the last one, was finding up and down. So you're going to get the sits bones finding down on the seat, and the head's going to be able to find up. And then similarly, you're going to be able to find that structure for spinal galant at the hips and the shoulders. Another contraindication are listening systems. So spinal galant, once it's integrated, you can use a listening system, but similar to ultrasounds, which we'll talk in a second. There are little laguna on the back of the back that stimulate and allow us to understand where our body is in space when we move. So again, if I move like this all day, I'm stimulating those little hairs on the back of my back to understand where I am in space. That's why they keep moving. So if you do a listening system, those little hairs on the back are going to be stimulated, but they don't have any organization because there's no structure at the shoulders or the hips. And so it goes in and it literally is confusing for the brain because it's like being overstimulated and your body's like, what do I do with this? I think listening systems are great after spinal galant is integrated. Pregnancy ultrasounds. So again, those little laguna on the back, the ultrasound machine actually causes those little hairs on the body to hyperactivate and raise on end. And so for especially at that 8-week, when they're trying to figure out if the woman is pregnant, they do an 8-week ultrasound, but that's when the reflex is trying to develop because it's developed by 10 weeks. And you're causing a lot of difficulty for that child to figure out, again, where they are in space. And when you're in the uterus and you're only this big, you're able to move around and you're able to feel where I am in space. And then you hyper stimulate those little hairs and it causes them to not understand where they are in space anymore. So that reflex doesn't develop correctly. 1 or 2 ultrasounds is probably not the hugest deal. We've been able to integrate children who have had 1 or 2 with spinal galant. Usually it's like, that 8-week pregnancy verification and then the like 32-ish week anatomy ultrasound. And that doesn't seem terrible. We can still integrate. But once they hit 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it gets very, very difficult to be able to integrate the reflex because the hairs are no longer listening. So we can no longer give the information to the system because it's just not listening anymore. So for me personally, I had my last baby and we did one ultrasound at 34 weeks just to make sure that I could deliver naturally. And they were really accommodating to me because I came up with this article that shows that it is unsafe, excuse me, the site says obstetric ultrasound should only be done for medical reasons and exposure should be kept as low as reasonably achievable because of the potential for tissue heating. So I was able to provide that article to my obstetrician and they said it was okay that I didn't do ultrasounds. I also did not do Doppler listening for the heartbeat because that's again doing the same thing. So they just used a really good stethoscope to be able to hear the baby's heartbeat. And that ultrasound, or yeah, that article is cited in my reference page. So this is my almost 4-year-old now. But you can see that this is a terrible picture, that she has no stability line here at the hips and she has no stability line here at the shoulders because she's on a swing. And so it's going to be really hard to find any kind of stability on a swing. But it was a really good example. She lost her neck, she lost her posture, she's hyper flexing the this left side of her body and overextending this right side of her body just to be able to try and find that plane again. She doesn't always look like this when she's swinging, but it was a good picture to show. So what you're looking for is there to be a differentiation between the neck and the shoulder for movement with in isolation. So we want the shoulder to be able to move up and down on either side and not be worn like earrings. And then we also want the hips to be able to move up and down. So we've got up on this side and down on this side, and then opposite up on this side and down on this side, and not rotating forward or backward, but going straight up into the side of the body. So the reflex in its purest form would look like really big flexion on one side and really big extension on the other side, and then vice versa. And this is what looks like crawling. So if I have my hands and knees out and I start to crawl, this is when babies integrate spinal galant on their own naturally in development. So like we were talking about in breastfeeding earlier, the side that you're laying on with your shoulder down is your stability line, and the opposite side is your mobility line. So you would want stability coming from this side if I were laying down, and mobility to be free on this side to be able to do what I want to do for freedom of movement. If a child doesn't tolerate their clothes or tags, including a bra, this would be an idea that they do not have spinal galant integrated. And then I have my book. So the rhythmic movement method and the parent guide to MNRI both have symptoms and developmental delays that may occur in spinal galant, and you could look those up if you are interested. So this is also my Hana, and she has really good galant on the bottom, but you see how it's rhythmic. So that's one of the things that we're going to talk to you about today during the treatment, is that you need to have that really good rhythmic movement in spinal galant because it eventually turns into our gait pattern with walking. With vestibular, you're going to activate the vertical semicircular canal, just like trunk extension. And with proprioception, you're going to load the joints in to create the shock absorption against the stability line. With vision, when you are in side lying, you should have sustained eye contact looking forward, so central vision. And for the treatment, we are building the shoulder, building the hip, and potentially doing the archetype poster. So I am going to save the treatment until last so that I can clear off the table that I'm using and demonstrate the technique. Here is a baby that I got permission from mom to share, who had 7 ultrasounds. And you can see in this first one, in this first video here, she's actually going into TLR2 instead of letting me get her into Spinal Galant. So we'll watch that one. And she cries a lot. I apologize. I can actually turn the volume off and I'll talk through it instead because she just is so confused by the reflex. So I am trying to get her on that stability line on her other shoulder, and I'm trying to get that ear in alignment with the shoulder and the hip. And she is pushing her head backwards. So I'm gently, gently, gently. It might look like I'm forceful, but I am definitely not. Gently moving her head and trying to get in her ear in alignment with her body. Then I'm doing the sensory stroke, which I'll show you on a person who isn't wiggling around. And I stimulate suck to try and pull her eyes and her head into the correct plane, and she still goes back into TLR2 and she gets mad at me. And so I'm trying to pull her head into the correct plane. I attempt to isolate the shoulder and she goes back into TLR2 again. You guys can come watch if you want. So this is my attempt on the other side. I thought, maybe the other side is smarter. Let's see if the other side works. You can see her head is still back in extension, and I'm attempting to try the hip first instead of the shoulder. And she keeps bringing her head back into extension. So I keep trying to give her the binky so that she soothes and she brings her head back into alignment. I'm trying to organize her both body and bringing her back into a calm state. And we just can't get it done. So I wanted to show how if you use a different technique with rocking, that you might get a little bit more organization, which she is absolutely getting with rocking. And you see her head pull forward and her hip loosen up and her shoulders start to come away from her ear. And she's still crying, but at least she is tolerating the therapy more. And a really easy thing for you to do at home, just get them into side lying and start rocking them up and down. Much better. You can see the ear above the shoulder, above the hip. I'm isolating the shoulder there, which she wasn't letting me do before. And she's doing suck and she's not losing her binky, which is amazing. Babies have so much to do. You see the sensory stroke again. And then she's letting me go in and out. So the rhythmic movement method by Dr. Bloomberg is a really good tool to be able to use all of his different rhythms that he gives as treatment strategies. So home program will be squeezing shoulders, squeezing hips, doing that rhythmic movement and side lying and doing stability pushes. Who would like to be my model? So Dan, face the camera first, right here in front of me.
Standing.
Yeah, stand and face the camera. So this would be like, I'm trying to build this line in his shoulders. And so one of the ways that I can do that is literally pulling, stay where you are. I would do this in lying, most likely, since he didn't fell over, but trying to pull that stability line out to the shoulder on both sides. And then once they have this really nice line going through, because we don't want their shoulders to be in front, then I can give him a nice squeeze, push together, and release. Push together, release. So this is something that you can kind of do with your students, maybe not doing such a quick release, but something that like you can grab them down on their shoulders and like push together and release, or like your kids are standing in church and they're super wiggly and you're just like, let me give you a little bit of squeeze. So same thing at the hips, you're gonna squeeze together and release. And squeeze together, release. And Dan, you've got no release. We'll work on that. Okay, so if you get side lie on the table, back, right shoulder down, head over there. Bend your knees. Okay, perfect. So we want the body to be in a crawl pattern. Yeah, I need to give you a pillow. Want the body to be in a crawl pattern. So if the feet are back here, we're working on a different reflex. So the feet need to come up here. You're okay? You okay? Yeah. Okay. And then we want the hip, the shoulder, and the ear all to be in alignment, and there to be a stability line going through each one of those planes. So you can't quite see it on video here, but his stability line starts here and his other shoulder is over here. So I'm going to bring his other shoulder underneath him, and then I'm going to do that pull that you saw in standing to pull his shoulder into alignment. So he's got this really nice stability line here, and he already has a really nice stability line here. So there's nothing I need to do. So after I've got both the shoulder and the hip squared, I'm going to push on them down, just like I was doing with the shoulders going this direction. I'm going to push down on the hip here into the table, and I'm going to push down here into the table. If they're small enough, I can just do both at the same time. So that creates this side of the body, but I want to create mobility on this side. So I'm going to do the sensory stroke, which begins at T1, just like we said, that spinal level stimulus is T1 and L5. I'm going to hold and I'm going to pull apart. So my hands are trying to move apart from each other. And on anyone over 6 months, you do at least 3 sensory strokes, but 5 or 7 is fine. And then I'm going to isolate just the shoulder or just the hip. So I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to put it on the scapula in the back, and my other hand is on the pec on the front. And it's not quite the pec, it's at the raglan line, like where a baseball uniform would be. I'm at that line right there, because you see how I can control the shoulder going back. I can have it on the front, and then I'm on a plexus, neurologically called the brachial plexus. So I'm going to hold those 2 areas. I'm going to find that line again because he lost it just a little. So I'm going to realign so that his ear and his shoulder are in the same plane. Okay. And I'm going to show his body up and down. And you're not going to help me. Up and down. And then I'm going to show his hip up and down. Up and down. After I've isolated those 2 and they look good, then I can move on to doing them together. If that one doesn't look good, I'm never going to do them together, because then I'm going to train the wrong idea. So then I'm going to do a sensory stroke again. his arm were smaller, I would hold the back of the scapula with my thumb and the front would go on the brachial plexus, but he's too big for that. So I'll just grab what I can. And then I'm going to go together. Let the brain have time to figure out what it is that I'm doing. And then apart. And I lost his shoulder. It went forward. So I would reset because I don't want it to go anywhere except for straight up and straight down. So I'm going to reset, do a little sensory stroke to remind the brain we're doing sensory and motor. And then I'm going to isolate the shoulder to go to the ear, back down, together, and apart. And then I would repeat it on the other side. But one of the things that you can't see is that his ear is straight up above his shoulder. And that right shoulder is directly underneath the left shoulder. So that's really, really important because I'd much rather people try to create the stability line than create mobility. Because if they don't have stability in their body, then you're never going to get mobility on the other side. And that one went a lot faster than I thought. Do we have any questions?
You are a phenomenal teacher.